Hello. If you notice something different, it probably is that I'm speaking English. Due to popular demand, I have now decided to do some videos in English as well. So essentially, I'd be recording what I do in Spanish and English, and some stuff that I do in English I'll translate to Spanish afterwards. But just to summarize it real quick, how I stated it in the Spanish video, essentially there's a lot of works in English that have not been translated to Spanish, and if they haven't been done so properly. And I think the same principle also applies to English. There's a lot of good Spanish, Latin American philosophy work that has not been translated at all to English, or when it has, it's been barbarous. So I plan on exposing some of those, as well as going through some things that are essential if you are to study philosophy. So today's episode is going to be essentially a translation of the first episode I did. It's going to do with Hegel's philosophy, his absolute idealism, and his Hegelian dialectic, so the logic behind the systematic approach that he takes to understanding all of reality. So in order to understand Hegel, I think we first have to back up and understand where his foundations lie. And similar to pretty much everyone else that came after Kant, Hegel's foundation lies in Kant. Essentially, Kant is, by some philosophers, considered the defining end of the modern era of philosophy, by others the beginning of the contemporary era. But regardless, Kant marks what could be interpreted as a synthesis between the overwhelming duality in the modern period of philosophy between the rationalist and the empiricist. And I even though he does represent a synthesis between both, I would think it's fair to say that his largest influence lies in David Hume, and he himself has a quote that says that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. So he takes that skepticism that Hume brings about, and in a sense runs with it. So to grossly oversimplify Kant's philosophy in order to get to Hegel, his philosophy is mainly his theory of knowledge is sort of a dualism, in a sense, between the phenomena, the world of our experience, and the world in itself. He makes this distinction because we have these categories of the mind that are time and space that, in a sense, intercept our sensation of reality and manifest it in our brain in a different form than what it came in. So since we don't know about the real things in themselves, the phenomena, because of these categories, what we know is the phenomenal world. That's essentially sort of the foundation that Hegel starts with, and Hegel tends to agree with Kant on many things. He accepts that the phenomenal world, but he doesn't just say that the phenomenal world is just the world of our experience. He says that the phenomenal world is the world that exists. So he completely eliminates the nomina, and he states that it's unnecessary to have a whole section of your philosophy that all you could say is that you can't know nothing about it. So we see a transition from Kant to Hegel that is marked by the transition from transcendental idealism in Kant, which represents his move of human beings actually creating, in a sense, their mind determining the world, their mind shaping the world. So at that point, we had interpreted the world as a set of things that we see passively. Kant gives us active agency in our interpretation of the world. Hegel's not so sure about that. Hegel considers that some sort of subjective idealism. Hegel says that the things in the world have ideas of themselves, and it's not that we are imposing, that we're shaping the world as if we're actually doing so subjectively, idealistically, but rather that the world itself, the universal whole, and the things that make part of this whole are absolutely ideal. So absolutely ideal does not mean that they are just idea and that the material doesn't matter. Actually, he considers the ideal entrenched in the material. But absolutely ideal refers to the engine by which movement happens, by which change happens, and this engine is ideas. So essentially, ideas are the force that moves change, right? The idea is at the center of reality, and as idea unfolds itself through the dialectic, which I will mention in a bit, is how we're able to move. So if there's also an emphasis on movement and change, which we can see sort of his foundations of that in Heraclitean philosophy. Heraclitus is a pre-Socratic philosopher about 6 centuries before Christ, and he has a very famous quote that says that we don't ever step in the same river twice. So essentially this emphasizes the constant change that is essential to life, and Hegel accepts this change, and what he ultimately ends up doing is creating a logic that helps us map onto the world and interpret this change, this constant change through the dialectical logic. So when we refer to Hegelian absolute idealism, what we are referring to is the fact that ideas are what moves essentially the world. Ideas are what unfolds reality. And the dialect is essentially Hegelian dialectic. It's the logic behind that idea. So the etymology of the word dialect is traced back to a conversation between two people where one says an argument, the other says their other argument, and then there's this sort of synthesis, this culmination between both that sort of transcends each one's argument. So this similar relation is what Hegel uses to interpret literally the universe, everything, and the particular things that are inside the universe. So the way this manifests itself is in a threefold manner of contradictions of ideas. So we would have an original idea, which it's called a thesis, an original thesis. And within that thesis, we would have things that are contradictory to it. He ends up stating that there's 3 different types of contradictions, but that'd be too detailed to mention in an introductory video. But within these ideas, there's these contradictions that clash with the overall whole of the idea, and which end up developing an antithesis, so a rival idea. And when this thesis and antithesis crash, in a sense, they transcend into a synthesis, which is manifested by, in a sense, getting the best aspects of both and sort of culminating them cohesively. And that synthesis itself becomes a thesis, but as this continues, what ends up happening is that ideas continue eliminating their own contradictions, and Hegel would say that at some point there will be a full elimination of contradiction where we're able to perfectly map reality and the idea in the whole and in the particular. And he would say that is when history ends, because these conflict of the contradictions of the ideas are really what mark history. So it's manifested not really as a straight line, a straight progressive line up, but it's manifested as a bunch of ups and downs. When you look at it from a closer perspective, when you step back and analyze the line, yes, it is going seemingly in one direction, but it does have a lot of back and forths between the theses and the antithesis and the synthesis. Now, how can we see this example in the world? Because essentially what this is intended to be, what this theory was intended to be, was a systematic approach of understanding everything, right? So how can we apply this theory to the world? And I think a good example is when we grow up. Essentially, when we grow up, we are at our first stage of growing up, we accept pretty much everything our parents say. They are our authority of truth. We just accept them. And then we get to a point where we start becoming rebellious. So preteen era, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after. And then in that era, we go from accepting everything to denying everything. And then we come to an age where we kind of culminate, in a sense, both. So we'll still be skeptical about what our parents say, but we're not going to just be automatically rebellious against them. So I think this example maps the threefold attitude of Hegelian dialectic quite well. A simpler one that I used in the Spanish video is if we're looking at a color and I say it's red and you say it's blue and another person comes and says it's purple. So it's a simpler example, but it signifies sort of the relation between the ideas and the relationship between the contradiction within an idea. So Hegel's importance has been tremendous. As a philosophy major, I think the philosopher that has helped me the most is Hegel, and that is because of his systematic approach at looking at the world. Once you look at the world through the lens of Hegelian dialect, kind of changes the perspective. And it's not really the case that things weren't looked at in a similar Hegelian dialect before Hegel. I think they were, but Hegel really is able to map and describe that way of interpreting the real through the dialect. So Hegel's work is tremendously influential, not only to the people who accepted it, like for example Marx accepts Hegel but materializes it and applies the dialect to human society and human history. But it's also influential to people who would tend to disagree with Hegel. So we can see it in Kierkegaard as a direct rejection of Hegel and giving rise to the birth of existentialism, which is questionable. I would tend to say that existentialism would start with Schopenhauer, but that's another video. So yeah, Hegel, like Kant, is of tremendous importance, and we ought to interact with Hegel. He is known to be one of the toughest philosophers to interact with. So something I said in the Spanish video was that I do recommend people to begin with encyclopedic text. So one of the texts that we used in one of my first few years of university is a W.T. Jones text. He's a professor of philosophy, and essentially he divides philosophical eras very traditionally, so classical, medieval, modern, but then when it comes to contemporary, he divides it between the 19th and the 20th century. So he essentially has like 60, 70 pages on each philosopher, or on each movement in philosophy, which is great because it's not like some short 5-page summary, but it's also not the primary text. So I mean, if for a student starting philosophy now, I do recommend to build a foundation with these encyclopedic texts and then move on to reading primary sources. So for Hegel, the primary source would be the Phenomenology des Geistes. So in English, that would be the phenomenology of spirit or mind, translates as both. And yeah, he wrote that in he wrote that a few years before he wrote The Science of Logic. I'm not, the date's not coming back to me, but yeah, this book is where he starts to describe absolute idealism and the threefold manner of the dialectic. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Subscribe, like the video, do whatever everyone else says. But most importantly, I want it to be an interactive channel. So please, if I made any mistakes, fire me up in the comment section. If I didn't and you just want to expand on some things I said, or you feel like I didn't treat Hegel sufficiently, please interact in the comment section. And that way we can both grow. I can grow with my interaction with you guys, and yeah, so I plan on doing maybe 2 to 3 videos a week. So I plan on having this channel be quite active. So if you clicked up subscribe, you don't have to worry about just having a wasteful subscription to a channel that doesn't post. I'm planning on doing this because at some point I plan on teaching philosophy. I am finishing my last year in undergrad and going into philosophy PhD next year. So the ability to not just write what I'm learning in paper or understand it, but express it and sort of teach it is something that I'm trying to develop early. So please be interactive and follow me on this journey of philosophical growth. Thank you.